But we find absolutely no knowledge of anything biblical anywhere before the turn of the 3rd century before BCE. We have thousands of documents across Egypt, across Palestine, across Babylonia. None of these documents do we find even the slightest hint of any kind of familiarity with the Bible. In scholarship, I think there would be very few scholars who would say that Abraham was a historical figure. Not a single one for centuries of people knowing anything about the Torah. We define Judaism as people who observe commandments from the Torah and live by those commandments. That's the definition of a Jewish person. And we don't find that before the 2nd century BCE. Under the radar, there was this greater religious reality of Yahwism. Yahwism is simply having the deity called Yahweh as your main ethnic deity and the head of the pantheon. But the data points that we do have all point to the area of what is modern-day Syria as the place where Yahwism began.
But if what you're saying is true, what does that mean for the Abrahamic faiths, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam? So welcome, Gad.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. You're here from Israel.
Yep.
That's where you live now?
That's right.
Okay. And you've done a little bit of a podcast tour over the last couple of days,
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind. Like two episodes back to back with Neil and with Derek. And it was, like I told you, it's 5 hours, more than 5 hours, almost 6. But that was great, and that was awesome. And yesterday with Danny Jones, and now here.
Good, yeah. And then back to Israel tomorrow.
Tomorrow morning, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to get enlightened, to have the audience learn from you today. It's going to be fantastic. This is new to me. Your story is new to me. But one of the things that I have wanted to dive into on this channel is the topic of ancient religion and like what's real and what's not real. What's the reality of the situation? What do we know and versus what do we believe?
Yeah.
So that's why I think your research is so fascinating, and it shakes things up. I mean, in terms of like just the what we think we understand and what we think that we believe and that we're praying to. You know,
that's right.
Yes.
That's right. I should probably say right off the bat that I'm not interested in changing anyone's faith or even sowing doubt necessarily. But I'm just here to offer the scientific perspective. And there are ways I've known people who are very, very religious who can accept this, and there are others who can't. Of course, everyone's different. But I'm not here to necessarily, be antagonistic to anyone's religion or faith.
Yeah.
Although some of the things, or quite a few of the things I'm about to say, are probably going to shake some preconceptions. But yeah. So, but the goal is to establish our knowledge based on scientific fact.
Yeah, to research the truth and to understand the truth. Yeah, cool. That's awesome. Has any of your work been challenged, been debunked in any way, or is it? Do people have a hard time poking holes in it?
So far, yes. I mean, I've had people say that they simply don't agree because they don't agree, without providing any counter arguments. So that I get a lot. People just say, "Oh, I don't buy that." Okay, that's fine. I'm fine with people challenging this scientifically and showing me where I'm wrong. And I'm human like anyone else, and I can be wrong, and it's fine. Science progresses through people trying their best, and then other people coming along and showing where there are holes in that theory. That's true for the so-called hard sciences like physics and others, where people try their best. There's a hypothesis. They try to show how it might work or not. And then the next generation or the other scientist comes in and shows where things might have been not exactly thought through. And that's how we progress. We progress as a field, not as an individual. So I do my best to be as accurate and as precise as methodological as I can. But what's really important to me, and I think what's really important, should be important now, is to be as transparent as possible. Not just to be accurate. Because transparency makes it more evident to see where I might have been wrong or other people and I might have been wrong, and then we can progress by other people coming from different angles and showing the path to follow. So so far what I've been publishing has not met any serious challenge. And if it is a serious challenge, I'll embrace it. I'm not here to defend but just be right, at all costs. I'm here to make sure that the field is moving along and that we are getting more and more acquainted with the actual historical facts rather than what we would have we prefer to see or anything like that. So but so far nothing, and except for people just saying that they don't like it or they don't. Yeah.
Sure, sure. It can be, I guess people can take offense to some of your work. But
and it includes scholars. I mean, not just necessarily religious. I mean, there are some scholars who've written just one sentence, not convincing. And it's fine that you're not, but tell me why. Tell me what's the reason. Analyze, provide some analysis. But just saying it didn't convince me, it's just simply not a scientific response. And I try to never do that. When I disagree with another scholar, I always provide the reason why. And that's also out of respect for that other scholar. I mean, I guess it's in a way it's also disrespectful to just say not convincing without explaining why. So I think we should avoid, all of us as scholars should avoid that kind of argumentation. But other than that, it's really actually, and it has been adopted by quite a few of my colleagues as well. Maybe with some modifications, but still, the gist of it has been received well.
So before we get into kind of some of your research and your work, you're from Israel. You live in Israel currently.
Correct, yes.
So I mean, it's a bit of a war zone right now. Yeah. What is that like? And I mean, you have to see when you look back, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Israel. I mean, this is not a new thing.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's a war zone. Again, like I said, I don't talk about politics, so I won't go into that. But it is a very unfortunate situation, right? Very unfortunate on all sides. That's pretty much all I would say about this. Yeah,
fair enough. Okay, well, yes. So on to, I want people to be able to follow along and understand your work and sort of, how it has, how it's come to be. And in order to kind of understand the points that you're making and the broader point that you're making, I think it's important to just understand a bit about the history of the Israelites and also about just the Jewish Bible in general. And so, could you just maybe walk us through a little bit of like the standard, generally agreed upon timeline of the Israelites and of the people of Israel, and then potentially we can talk a little bit about how your view and your research differs from that standard timeline.
Sure. So there are several timelines, right? Not just one. There's the religious timeline, and even with the religious timelines, there are all kinds of different timelines as well. And then there's the scholarly timeline, and if you want to talk about all of them, we'll talk all day of just about these timelines. So, but according to the traditional interpretation of the biblical text, we're talking about the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's around 2000 before the current era, and maybe 1800 before the current era, somewhere like that, in the first half of the second millennium before the current era. Somewhere along, around that timeline, and then we're talking about Egypt and about Moses and about the Exodus, and then the departure from Egypt, as I said, the Exodus, and then coming into the land, into Canaan, and the conquest of Canaan, and then, of course, the judges and King David, Solomon, and everything else that we know from the Bible. So that's really, at a very high level, the timeline for the establishment of the Israelites / Judea in the region. And then there's the exile of the northern, what's called the Northern Kingdom, the Israelites, and that's around 722 before the current era, so 8th century. And then later on, of course, the destruction of what's called the first temple, and that's 586, 587. There are different schools on this, but 586 before the current era as well. Of course, all these dates are before the current era, and so that's under the Babylonians, and then the Persian period begins around 550. Before the current era, and then that ends at the last quarter of the 4th century, and then we're talking about the Hellenistic period. So after the conquest of Alexander the Great or Alexander the Third, we're talking about the Hellenistic period, and you have the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century before the current era, and establishing this kingdom, this new Jewish kingdom in the region, which there was no kingdoms for a very long time, and they're reestablishing that. And in the 1st century, King Herod builds his version of the temple, and really creates this monumental building that we still see elements of today. And then we're moving into the Common Era, 1st century. And that's where Christianity starts to be established and to grow to eventually become the religion of the Roman Empire. So that's really at the highest level possible the main points of the timeline.
And these were times where the Israelites were being conquered by the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks. Is that correct?
Well, the entire region was.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a very small portion of the region that was being conquered by these successive empires. We're talking about the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. We're talking about the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then the Persian Empire or the Achaemenid Empire, and after that the Greeks, the Macedonians, really the Macedonian Empire, and which is a Greek, of course, Greek culture. And then in the 1st century, 63 BCE, we're talking about the Romans taking over. So that's the Greco-Roman period there. So these are the kind of the main empires that the Israelites or the Judeans operated under.
Okay, and there's no dispute about this, really, right?
There's no dispute about this. There's no dispute about the fact. I mean, these are facts. There are really details that we discuss, and we want, if we want to be very precise. For example, the notion of a first temple and a second temple. That's not very scientific term because, I mean, there was a temple that was destroyed 586, 587 before the current era. Was that a first temple? According to the Bible, yes, because King Solomon, according to the Bible, built the first temple. But is it historically a first temple? We know that Jerusalem was a major city in the 14th century, 13th century, and so it was already a major city. It's inconceivable that it didn't already have a temple. Are we talking only about the first Yahwistic temple? Is that really necessarily the first? Were there others before it? We simply don't know. But even more importantly, the temple that was rebuilt after the destruction of this so-called first temple, immediately after the destruction, already still in the 6th century before the current era, we have something was built, maybe a temporary structure. Do you call that the second temple, this temporary structure? There was a monumental temple that was supposedly built also under Nehemiah. Is that now the third or the second? How do we number them? And then, as I mentioned, Herod. Is that now the third or the fourth temple? Is that still the second temple? So, really, from a scientific perspective, that's also something we need to establish. So that I actually avoid this dating by first temple, second temple. I use maybe expressions like first Commonwealth, second Commonwealth, because it's more of the way they identified, possibly. But so based on exiles rather than structures, right? But all of these are complex.
So Jewish people today believe that the religion that they're currently practicing goes back to what, 700 BCE, 800 BCE?
No, second millennium.
Second
BCE.
millennium
Yeah.
BCE. Okay.
So they're talking their religion that they're practicing today. They go back to Abraham, really.
Okay.
And as a founder.
Okay. And Abraham was 2000 BCE.
Well, according to the biblical chronology, it goes back to the first part of the second millennium BCE.
Okay. And this is where you differ from that sort of mainstream view.
Well, I mean, this is the religious view. In scholarship, I think there would be very few scholars who would say that Abraham was a historical figure. I don't think there's going to be. You'll find a lot of scholars who would actually say that. In my research, I also show that the whole concept of a founder of a nation coming from the East to found a new people, basically a new people group, a new nation. I mean, nation again is also an anachronistic word for that period, but founding a new people group, that is a very Hellenistic concept. In the Greco-Roman period, and also much before that, in the Hellenistic period, it was very common for people groups or for polis. I mean, polis is metropolis, right? Is the main city, to claim that their founder comes from the East. That was seen as something that bestows authority, bestows antiquity to the race, and makes it more serious, more to be taken seriously. So a lot of these Hellenistic polis had founding stories like that. Someone came from the East, but also Rome. Rome itself under Augustus. So it's one of the peaks of its power. Was made a concentrated effort. So Augustus hired Virgil to write the mythology of Rome. Okay, and there they had Aeneas, who was this hero from the Trojan War, and they said this is our founder. This also mythological figure from the Trojan War is now the founder of Rome, and they had this entire mythology built around it. So here, the Israelite mythology comes in very, very Hellenistic, in a very similar way. This founder of the race coming from the East and establishing, and also, of course, being very, very, very wise, very old, and also having direct communication with the divine, being chosen by the God, doing all kinds of miraculous things along the way. That is all of this is very characteristic of the Hellenistic founding legends. So it fits so well, the Hellenistic ideology and the Hellenistic ethics, that to me, that's a major argument why that story was conceived in the Hellenistic period. But beyond that, we find no knowledge of anything biblical, not just in the Torah or the Pentateuch, but we find absolutely no knowledge of anything biblical anywhere before the turn of the 3rd century before BCE. So between 400 and between 300 and the 300s BCE and the 200s BCE, that's kind of the divide where we start getting some echoes about elements that can be related to the biblical, to the Bible. So personal names, for example. So we have a lot of personal names. We have thousands of documents from Jewish sources or Yahwistic sources. I'll explain in a little bit what the difference is between Jewish and Yahwistic. But we have thousands of documents across Egypt, across Palestine, across Babylonia. In none of these documents do we find even the slightest hint of any kind of familiarity with the Bible. No, thousands of documents, and you would expect to see something, some idiomatic expression, some names that are names of heroes from the Bible, some even on the legal, in terms of legal, because we have a lot of legal documents. So in the Bible, very famously, you have the witness of 2 or 3 people, right? And that is a very famous biblical requirement, and we don't find that anywhere as well. So there's a lot of, each one of these individually can be explained away, saying, well, maybe this or that, and there are a lot of excuses. But the fact is that we simply have no positive evidence for any knowledge of the Bible anywhere. And we have a lot of negative evidence of people doing things that are completely contrary to what the Bible is saying.
Prior, there's no evidence of the Bible prior to that.
Around 300 BCE.
The Hellenistic period, the time where Alexander the Great had essentially. So it does it have something to do with the Great Library?
That's my thesis. So a book I'm working on speaks about the Alexander. So as a historian, I always look for triggers. What has changed? What caused the change? And so we as a historian, we look at the data. Epigraphic data. Epigraphic means the study of inscriptions of ancient texts. So we looked at these texts that were written in real time in the 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. We look at the actual text. So we looked at the epigraphic data, and we see when we start detecting changes, right? And so the first question is, what changed? What caused this change? Something must have caused this change. It doesn't just happen out of the blue. So and it's a pretty massive change. Around the 3rd century, around 300, we start seeing the Greeks write about the Jewish people and mention them in their own writings, and mention that a character by the name of Moses, for example. But it's not the biblical Moses; it's a different Moses. And so we start seeing echoes like that on the radar that start to be at least related to the Bible somehow, and we start seeing names in documents that are that we know we're familiar with from the Bible as well, which we did not see for centuries before that. We didn't see any of these names, and now we're starting to see them. And so we start seeing like dots on the radar around around 300 BCE. Now, what has and again, this is a massive change because for centuries we didn't see anything like that, and now we're starting to see it, and not just from the Yahwists or /Jews themselves writing in their own documents, but also the Greeks writing about them with elements that are related to the biblical corpus. So it's a massive change internally and externally. So as a historian, what has changed? What was the trigger? What could have been the trigger for such a massive change? And to me, for more than one reason, which I'll get into in a little bit, the major cataclysmic change and event that really shaped the world from that point on, even to this day, is the establishment of the Alexandria Museum, the place of the muse, of which the library was a part of. And so that to me was the change. Now, not only because of the dating, it corresponds to the date of these changes, but also what happened within the so-called Library of Alexandria. And we need to understand that Alexandria as a city, as a phenomenon, is the implementation by Alexander and his childhood friend Ptolemy I. They grew up together. They studied with Aristo, the philosopher. They studied in the academy, in Aristo's academy in Athens, which was later run by Theophrastus, the heir, so to speak, the intellectual heir of Aristo. And Aristo had a very scientific take on things. So he checked everything. He critically examined a lot of the kind of preconceptions of his day, even those of Herodotus. So he checked everything that Herodotus said. He would check, and he would go send people to verify, check and verify everything. Very very scientific in the sense of science of those days. And so they wanted to establish a city that is very, that kind of reflects that worldview. I'm, of course, simplifying a lot, but that's basically it. So the city was established in a grid pattern, very organized. It had coin-operated machines. It had, coin-operated machines in 300 BC. And it had automatic doors. The door of the temple of Serapis in Alexandria would open automatically because of the heat. It was triggered from the heat of the altar, of the fire that you would offer your offerings to the deity.
What is a coin-operated machine? What is that?
You had coins at the time, and you would just, the weight of just the same way it operates today. The weight of the coin comes in, and you can buy stuff, or you can. So it's really it's a coin-operated machine, and the concept. Obviously, there was nothing to prevent them to doing it even then, but they thought about it. For anyone coming to Alexandria in the ancient world, this would be science fictional. It's almost like going to the Silicon Valley, in the 90s, so it's really, you're exposed to the latest technologies, the latest ideas. You're at the cutting edge. Now, in Alexandria, there was this huge complex of the palace of Ptolemy, or the Ptolemy dynasty. And within that palace, they had the museum, or the place of the muses, the dedicated to the muses. And within the museum, you had the library. And the library was really a completely new model of how to run a library. There were libraries before, but they weren't a library in the same sense of the Alexandria library, because they were more of, they were really archives. There were places where you would store documents, and a lot of them were just omen texts, like prophecies, and you would just store them for posterity. And they were used for training scribes to write, and they were used to store administrative documents, contracts, and things like that you would need to. But they weren't a place to study the text. So the Alexandria Library was built on the idea that there are these Greek, really important central Greek heritage works, literary works. And they noticed that there are, again, this is very Aristotelian, the idea of looking at these texts and now seeing all of the differences between the different versions, the different manuscripts for Homer, for Hesiod, and other Greek authors. And to say, well, there are contradictions between the different versions, and there are things where they just not only disagree but go squarely against one another. We need to study that and decide together what's the real version and what's not. And so what they started doing is they started creating a more authoritative text, a more critical text, and they developed the same techniques and the same methodologies that we later find in the Bible. Okay, so that's now the second. I talked about the epigraphic material, but now I'm talking also about the way to approach these texts, which we also see in the Bible. But those methodologies were developed in Alexandria for Greek texts, not for the Bible. So, for example, they would take certain texts that showed different options. They would put them side by side, or they would harmonize them, or they would create some kind of glue text to bridge between one text and the other. So they had all of these different approaches, these different techniques to create an authoritative version of Homer, an authoritative version of Hesiod, an authoritative version of Plato, and etc. So they would do this. They developed these techniques and these methodologies, and we find the same in the Bible. The same approaches of putting texts side by side, like the two creation stories that we have in Genesis, right? So it's side by side, and we find that across the Bible, and harmonizations, where you have an event that happens and it's mentioned again, but it seems to contradict its first appearance. So they write a text that harmonizes the two, and of course adding glue text, so adding more additional text that kind of bridges to texts that were older and might have not agreed upon them. So you glue them together with the story, with some kind of narrative. So all of these techniques we later find in the Bible as well. So Alexandria was the trigger. To me, it's absolutely clear that Alexandria was the trigger for this great enterprise of collecting texts, writing new glue texts or new texts that are needed for this endeavor, and the addition and redaction of these texts, harmonizing them, putting them side by side, all of these things, all of these methodologies, we find in the Bible from the 3rd century on. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't older texts that made it into the Bible. I have an article about a passage from Amos on the oracles against the nations from the book of Amos that I can date pretty precisely to the 7th century, late 8th century and the 7th. I show that there are different layers there. But I can date them because I show how precisely they are related to Assyrian idioms that were known at the time as imperial idioms. So the moment I have an anchor, extra biblical anchor that I can hold on to, that helps me date certain texts. But it's only one passage from Amos. It's not the entire corpus. I think it's impossible to date an entire book to a specific date because every book has been worked on and edited and redacted. And so you can't say, well, the book of Amos was composed at a certain time. It depends on the passage. And sometimes we know that sometimes they change just one word in a verse. Okay, so how do you date that verse, right? If it's been modified. So and we talked about this a number of times over this past tour here. The Bible is a battlefield. That's a good way to look at it because you have so many different sects, different ideologies vying for influence and trying to show that their theology, their view is the correct one, and they all somehow had left a mark in the biblical text. Now, a question I often get is, okay, well, as a historian, why do you look at Herodotus as more more faithful historical source than the Bible? And first of all, I don't. I mean, I'm also very, very critical of Herodotus, and I don't take his word for granted either. I always look for additional support before I assign some kind of probability to Herodotus. But there is a big difference between Herodotus and the Greek historians as compared to the Bible, because no one's identity was ever defined by Herodotus. No one says I'm a Herodotian, right? It's not an identity-forming document, whereas the Bible is. I mean, the Jews, the Jewish people from the earliest time that they could, so from around the 3rd century BCE and onwards, they saw this text as identity forming. And that's a whole different ballgame. Once your identity is defined by a certain text, or at least influenced by this text, you start taking it really, really seriously, and then you start getting into polemical discussions with other people who might think that they are also defined by this text, but might see it differently. They have a different theology. They are looking for a different savior, for example. They are looking for different ways to please the deity and to live a life that is observant of the commandments, but then you need to interpret the commandments. So the Bible is that battlefield of ideas. And I think that's one of the things that actually gives it beauty and richness, because you have all of these ideologies coming together and you see it in the text. When you read the text critically, you can see all of these layers, all of these footprints of editors and redactors over the generations coming in and manipulating the text. I'm not saying it pejoratively. I'm just saying manipulating, kind of working on the text to adapt it to their worldview. So the Bible is very unique in that sense.
So there existed texts and scrolls and writings prior to the library being invented. It's almost as if like it's kind of synonymous with the internet. I think if the Great Library, if we were to look back on ourselves 2,300 years from now,
that's very interesting. I never thought about it.
It's like what changed, and so we have this huge invention where people are now. Have this repository for information, and they're working on information and editing information and turning it into their own, and then identifying with the information, as you alluded to.
Correct.
And so this differs from the not from a scholarly standpoint, but from a religious standpoint. What you're articulating as the reality of human history differs from the religious viewpoint of what happened throughout human history. And so on the religious side, the timeline, it's not myth. It goes back to 2000 BC, and there were these texts and these writings and these scrolls that were all already in place prior to this, and that these were actual, not mythical people, but actual real people,
right? Real
people, and so
so that's a religious view. I mean, again, it's
and but there's a lot of evidence that you're alluding to that speaks to the fact that, or to the possibility or probability that these are myths and that they were really created after the third century.
Yeah, and it shouldn't surprise us. I mean, all of these founding stories that I alluded to. I mean, I spoke about earlier about the founding of these polis or even Rome. Right? These are all mythologies. So the Romans never even tried to hide the fact that this is a mythological. And Virgil as well. So Virgil was able to write the Aeneid, so the mythology of Rome, of the founding of Rome, from Aeneas.
When was Virgil?
So that's mid first century, Augustus, mid first century before BCE. And so he was able to write the equivalent of the Pentateuch, so the equivalent of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible. But he did that in meter and in rhyme, much harder to do than to write the Torah, which is kind of free text in a way. So he did that, but based on older materials. So the idea that Rome came from Aeneas, we find that already in the 2nd century before BCE in Rome. Just the people talking about that and as a concept. So he took pre-existing material, and very much like the Bible, he rearranged it, readapted it, rewrote it, added text, glue text, and all of these techniques that we mentioned earlier, and came up with this absolute masterpiece of the Aeneid. And again, very similar process happened with the Bible, especially with the Torah, with the first 5 books, and he did that in 10 years. I mean, it took him 10 years to write the equivalent of the Torah in a much harder format. So that could have been, if there's a concentrated effort in the 3rd century, let's say, to write that, that could be done very, very quickly. And I believe, so we have the Hebrew Bible, which is written in Hebrew, the Torah, these first 5 books, and then we have the Greek Bible. What's called the Septuagint, or the translation of the 70 sages, supposedly, who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. But this is not Greek. People need to realize, most people think it's actually translated into Greek, but it's really translated into Judeo-Greek. It's not the Greek that people would be familiar with in the Greek-speaking world. It's not exactly the same Greek. It is to someone, so like I started with classical Greek and only then came into contact with the Septuagint and kind of the Judeo-Greek world. And to anyone who's coming from correct Greek, real actual Greek, to the Judeo-Greek world of the Septuagint, it seems strange. It seems like a weird parallel universe where the Greek is sometimes even borderline incorrect. And many words are simply not part of the vocabulary of the Greek-speaking world. What they did with Judeo-Greek is translate Hebrew words into Greek, but not translate them into a Greek word per se, but translate the concept, the Hebrew concept behind these words into Greek. So there are words there that are being used that, if you don't understand the Hebrew word behind it, you really don't really. It's hard to understand the text. So so that's the Greek translation. I also date that to the 3rd century before the Common Era.
Okay. Okay.
Very close to the composition of the Hebrew text as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to get to the more of the evidence that this is really when it began. But first, I want to ask you about what the implications of what you're saying. And so everybody's kind of thinking, okay, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for religion? I mean, that's kind of like the key, the overarching point behind this entire podcast is really to understand, okay, if what you're saying is true, and we're going to go through the evidence for what you're saying, sure, kind of item by item. But if what you're saying is true, what does that mean for the Abrahamic faiths, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam?
It's hard for me to talk about that because it really is an individual path that the people listening to this need to take, or not. Certain people would hear this and simply just turn it off and just go and stick to the path that they're already on and refuse to be distracted.
But from a scientific standpoint.
So from a purely scientific standpoint, and again, that would doesn't necessarily impact the religious perspective. But from purely religious, scientific standpoint, the implications are also huge. First of all, on the relation of the relationship between the biblical text and the outside world. So if we date the Torah, as it is still done in large circles in the academic world, with dating the Torah to the 7th century or the 8th century BCE, I think now we should kind of revise that. And a lot of people are looking for parallels to the world of the 8th century, so the Neo-Assyrian world, for example. So they're looking for parallels in the Neo-Assyrian world. And there are parallels. And in fact, looking for parallels is not a very solid methodology, because a lot of these parallels that you find, so you might find some parallels in the narrative between the biblical text and a Neo-Assyrian text or a Neo-Babylonian text or even Ugaritic text, and you look for these parallels, but these very same parallels you find centuries later as well. Okay, these same narrative ideas, the same turns of phrases, the same legends that people refer to, you find from a certain point in time, and then they have a long lifespan. So it's really hard. So just working on parallelisms, I think methodologically is simply not very solid, scientifically speaking. So I prefer not to just look at parallels and look at the overall context, and look at especially at epigraphy. So at the primary sources that we deal with, and build from that, from solid data, which we will talk about, of course. So I mean, one implication is to take the Hellenistic period as a starting point for research. Again, my own research shows that there is material that is older in the Bible, that made it into the Bible, but to the main period where all of these different texts came together and there was a concentrated effort at creating an authoritative text, that is from that period. And so we need to start now reverse engineering from that period back to different, each one whatever their field of specialty is with regards to the biblical text. So that is one major implication, to focus more on the Hellenistic period and looking back rather than on these earlier periods, which are not well evidenced in the.
So double click on that though. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean in terms of like if people were, if the starting point is the Hellenistic period as opposed to 700 or 800 BC or 2000 BC, if that's the starting point, and people were not practicing Judaism prior to that starting point, does that mean that the Abrahamic faiths in totality, from a scientific or from a realistic standpoint, like the nature of reality, the world that we're truly living in, forget beliefs, just from a nature of reality standpoint, does that mean that the Abrahamic faiths are essentially null and void?
No. So they are mythological. I mean, they're a large part mythological, but certainly that does not nullify anything. I mean, in the ancient world, so this is a very modern question. In the ancient world, mythology was seen as a form of truth. It wasn't. Today, in the modern world, we see mythology almost synonymous with lie, right? It's someone trying to sell us something, and it's not real. But in the ancient world, mythology was part of life. People would always tell these stories to one another, and they would run with them. They didn't see it as someone trying to sell you something or some form of lie. Mythology was really part of daily life, and they would be transported by this. It would cause them to build up. So you have mythological traditions, and you have people building on top of these mythological traditions additional stories, and then they're adopted by a different culture, and they run with it. And we see a lot of this cross-pollination of mythology.
It always happens, and it's always. But when you're in the time that the religion is being practiced, it's not viewed as fake. It's not viewed as myth. It's viewed as real. Like, this is reality to the believers.
That's right.
And so 2,000 years ago, we might call it mythology today, but back then, this was the truth. This was the reality of the world that they lived in.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think, the challenging part that I'm having trouble kind of wrapping my head around and understanding is. Okay, so I went to Peru last week, and I got this little pendant. It's Viracocha, who is the god of the Inca people. And I go on Wikipedia, and I look and I start reading about Viracocha, and it's like, well, this is a mythological god of the Inca people.
Right.
But of course, to the Incas, he wasn't mythological. He was God.
Right. They simply didn't think in that vocabulary.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but if the Spanish Christians hadn't come to South America and committed genocide and wiped out the entire South American population, with swords and axes and diseases, then this Wikipedia wouldn't be saying that this is a mythological god today. Wikipedia might be saying this is the god of the Inca people. It wouldn't have turned into mythology. So it's kind of the same question that I'm trying to get to as it relates to the Israelites and the Jewish people. Does your research it essentially turns what people believe today is real? It essentially turns that into mythology today, here and now, I think, right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, unfortunately, people today in the modern world, they want this to be actual history, and it's important for them to be actually scientific history. And it's not, and so I mean, even we talked about Abraham and the patriarchs, but the case of Moses and the Exodus is even more acute. If we were to go back in time to the turn of the 3rd century, so around 300 or 250 BCE, or even the 2nd century BCE, you would find about 11 or 13 different Moseses in the Greek world that are not biblical. Okay, so you have Moses as this great military leader who is defeating the Ethiopians. You have Moses as an Egyptian priest. You have Moses as a polis builder, the founder of Jerusalem, and you have him as the teacher of Orpheus, as this great musician. You have him as an alchemist, like a magi type figure. You have all of and they're all Moses, right? And this is not the biblical Moses. And at the same time, you have at least 4 different exoduses. So the exodus of building Jerusalem. So not the exodus that we know from the Bible, 40 years walking through the desert, just going out of Egypt and immediately founding Jerusalem. So you have all of these different stories again, and what that shows also is that 3rd, 2nd century BCE, this story wasn't yet formalized, right? There are competing versions of this story. But what's really interesting is that some of these stories are dated to around 300 BCE. Some of these stories that talk about Moses, talk about the Jews in relation to Moses, but it's not the biblical story. So it's Moses as a lawgiver, and the Greeks, especially in Alexandria, were fascinated by lawgivers as a category of people. That already goes back to Theophrastus, the heir of Aristo, who wrote this huge compendium about 3 volumes on lawgivers in his time, both Greek and non-Greek, or Greek and barbarians. And he doesn't mention Moses. So in his day, if he would have, obviously, but because it's a compendium, he would have collected all these lawgivers. But in his day, which again is late 4th century, so around 320, 310, in his day, Moses was not yet considered to be a lawgiver. But very soon thereafter, maybe a couple of decades later, we start finding Moses as this lawgiver without giving us examples of the laws that he developed. And then they say that he was the one who divided the Israelites into 12 tribes. Again, that goes squarely against what the Bible says, right? But the idea that there were 12 tribes somehow was floating at the time. But it was clear that Hecataeus of Abdera, whom I'm quoting here, did not know the biblical version of these, because he's not even arguing with them. He just says this is how it was. He's not trying to show that his version is correct and theirs is not. He's basically just going on and saying this is this Moses person that I'm talking about, and this is his relationship to the Jewish people. And he talks about other, about leprosy and other characteristics as he sees it among the Jewish people. We have the generations following him amplifying these stories, adding to them. Again, now it becomes Moses as an Egyptian priest, for example, in Manetho, or Moses as this military leader, or the teacher of Orpheus, and all of these things that I mentioned. So we start seeing kind of a proliferation of different stories. But what's interesting is that the biblical version, what's really important to note, is that the biblical version is now polemicizing against all of these different traditions. Okay. So in the Bible, we find Moses for a very short period of time leprous, but then very quickly healed by God. In the story of the burning bush, he puts his hand into his coat, and he brings it out in its leprous, and then he puts it in, and it's healed. And then, so that's one of trying to show that he was not this leprous priest. He was. So it's kind of a polemical one of many. I mean, the entire story is peppered with arguments against the Greek tradition and showing how the Israelites. So, for example, this obsession with leprosy throughout the Pentateuch, and especially in Leviticus, again and again about lepers, whether natural or supernatural, because they also have the leprosy of homes. The walls are leprous. The clothes might be leprous. So it's a leprosy that we don't know of. I mean, supernatural type of leprosy. But they're trying to show how the Jewish people took leprosy really and purity really, really seriously. To what extent and to show that because so many of these Greek authors kind of disparagingly show the Jews as being these leprous people, and so they're arguing against this. Look at how seriously we take leprosy, and how seriously we take purity, and so that your accusation are simply wrong. And so really almost every aspect of the Greek view of Moses and of the Jewish people and of the Exodus or Exoduses gets a treatment in the biblical text. That means that the authors of this text are later because they're familiar with the accusations. So those texts should be, I believe, dated, and of course, they continue to be worked on. But a kind of the first stratum of these texts should be dated to roughly the end of the 3rd century BCE. But it's really interesting to see the give and take and kind of the polemics between the biblical text and the Greek texts that describe Moses and the Exodus and the Jewish people in Egypt and then going into Canaan.
So for my thick skull, who were people worshiping? What was, prior to in your mind, prior to say 400 BCE? What was the practice? What was the worship? Who was God?
Excellent question. So basically, we define Judaism as people who observe commandments from the Torah and live by those commandments or a certain interpretation of these commandments. So, for example, the Sabbath and the Day of Atonement and the main feasts like the Passover. So people who and of course the kosher diet. So people who follow a certain interpretation of the laws that are found in the authoritative texts. That's the definition of a Jewish person. And we don't find that before the 2nd century BCE anywhere. Now, as I said, we do have thousands of documents earlier than that, from the Persian period, in Egypt, in Palestine, and in Babylonia, so large areas, and that don't show any knowledge of the Torah or of commandments or of the Sabbath or the feasts and things like that. So those people, we don't really refer to them as Jewish as per se, but they're usually seen as Yahwists.
Yahwists.
Now, a Yahwist is a person for whom the main deity, the head of the pantheon, is a deity by the name of Yahweh or Yahweh, right? And that's really the simplest and the most accurate, I believe, definition of a Yahwist. Their main ethnic deity is a deity known as Yahweh or Yahoo. Okay. And you see it in their personal names. So the names has this theophoric element. Theophoric means God-carrying element within the name. So this Yahoo in the name itself. And so that's really what, there are no commandments that we can trace in these documents that they're following. They're not following any specific diet. They're not following necessarily any specific purity rituals that we can.
So they're eating pig.
They're eating
pork,
whatever they want.
Eating shellfish.
Right.
Prior to this time period.
Absolutely.
And they're worshiping a god named Yahweh.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. But he is the head of the pantheon. He's not exclusive. There is no monotheism.
Okay.
And there are other deities below this deity, and there are others of other ethnicities. But they also recognize them as gods. They're fully able to impact their lives as well. So those are the Yahwists. Okay. Now, what's in scholarship up to really kind of what my research shows, we used to think about Yahwists as proto-Jewish. So we used to look at Yahwism as early Judaism, and then it became Judaism when the authoritative texts and these commandments that people live by kicked in. And then there was no more Yahwism, right? It morphed it evolved, let's say, into this Jewish, more recognizable Jewish ecosystem. But my research shows that Yahwism continued with full force ahead as it spawned Judaism. So Judaism spawned from Yahwism, but Yahwism continued unabated, just continued down its path. And of course, it evolved in parallel to Judaism, which also evolved later on into Christianity, or at least it spawned Christianity in its turn. And so Yahwism continued as the dominant form of Yahweh worship way into the Common Era, and was the most popular form of Yahweh worship in the ancient world, more than Judaism or Christianity. If we were to go back in time now, about 2nd century of the Common Era, 1st century of the Common Era, or even the 3rd or the 4th century of the Common Era, you would, and you wanted to know what form of Yahweh worship is the most popular one. Is it Judaism? Is it Christianity? Is it something else? It would be Yahwism, not Judaism or Christianity, because all over the Roman Empire, all across the Roman Empire, we find a lot of amulets, curse texts, and things like that, where Yahweh is the active deity, protecting the people. Now, again, they're not living, they're not following any commandments, they're not any specific diets, but their main protector deity is Yahweh. So Yahwism continues, and was extremely popular in the first centuries of the Common Era.
So 2 questions. So today, when say Christianity, for example, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? And the Son is Jesus. Is the Father Yahweh?
I mean, in Christianity, yes.
Yes. Okay.
Well, again, it also there were, and I think there probably is still, and again, this is not my field. I'm not a scholar of Christianity, but I know that in the early days of Christianity, there were attempts to differentiate between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament as well.
Right.
So there's a lot. Everything is always much more complex than we think, and I think that there are still Christian movements here and there that still try to differentiate between, even today, between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament. So I
asked my mom, who is a 83-year-old Catholic woman who's a staunch Christian and Catholic, and I asked her, what's God's name? Because I grew up in Christianity as well, and I no longer practice, but I sort of walked away from it a few years ago, and but I asked her, who is your God? And she said, well, it's God. And I said, well, it's like Jesus. And I'm like, well, what about God the Father? Who is it? And she's like, it's just God. And I said, well, does he have a name? And she didn't know. She literally didn't know. And I think that's part of the confusion and the need for Christians to differentiate themselves from Jewish people. Their need to create that separation is potentially not really talking about who their God is, not even knowing what his name is, Yahweh, referring to him by that name. It's never, in 40 years of going to church, I never heard the name Yahweh one time. It was maybe in one song that they would recite. And I remember asking my wife, who was Catholic as well, who's Yahweh, and she had no idea. I mean, no idea who Yahweh is. But that is really the central piece of not only Judaism but Christianity. That's God the Father. That's God, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's in these in these specific religions, Yahweh is the kind of the original, the foundational deity. But of course, in Christianity, you have the idea of the Trinity is a 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, right? So that there's unity in plurality, according to the theology. What's interesting is we find the same idea also in Egyptian religion, millennia earlier. The idea that the idea of 1 in 3 and 3 in 1, not just the 3 deities, not just a triad, but an actual Trinitarian idea. In fact, there are beautiful, beautiful theological texts, purely Egyptian, have nothing to do with Christianity, that were written thousands of years or more than 1,000 years before Christianity, that talk about a 3 in 1 and 1 in 3. I mean, the triad or the 3 deities was the most basic building block of the Egyptian religion. I mean, they also had the Enneads, the nine deities, and different configurations. But the 3 is a basic building. I mean, in the Egyptian language, the 3 lines, the number 3, just means plurality. So you would have, in the language, if you wanted to have a noun and to show that this noun is plural, you just add 3 lines to it. It means plurality. So three is really kind of a very, very basic building block in Egyptian
Sure.
Religion.
So so Yahweh or Yahwehism prior to the 3rd century BCE, prior to the Hellenistic period, prior to the Great Library, prior to Alexander the Great, that we had Yahwehism, and then we had Judaism after that, and then Christianity after that would develop as an offshoot of it. But how far back does Yahweh himself go? How long were people worshiping
Before
Yahweh?
I answer that, I just want to make it really, really clear, because what you just said, that's kind of the traditional view.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to change now is the historical reality, really, that Yahwism did not morph into Judaism, that morphed into Christianity, or that spawned Christianity. But Yahwism continued and continues in a sense to this day.
Right.
And I think it's really important to realize this. Also to better understand Christianity and to better understand Judaism of the first centuries of the Common Era. Yahwism spawned out Judaism, it spawned Christianity, it spawned what's called Gnosticism, the Gnostic sects as well, which are in many ways kind of hold on to many of the quote unquote traditional elements of Yahwism. So we find certain elements that we find at Elephantine, we find in certain Gnostic texts centuries later. So Yahwism, that's really for me really, really important. Maybe the main part of my research right now is establishing just how powerful and how central Yahwism continued to be while Judaism was being developed in parallel, and while Christianity was spawned kind of out of Judaism. The more we realize this, the more we understand also why the spread of Christianity was so quick and so powerful in the first centuries, because the ground across the empire was already prepared through Yahwism. So I think this is now kind of something that we should research, and certainly I'm devoting a lot of my research to this, but the implications of Yahwism on the study of the Abrahamic religions, and not just the Abrahamic religions, because it took elements from Egyptian religion, it took elements from Zoroastrianism, from the Iranian religion. So the implications of looking at Yahwism as its own kind of the religion that has so far been under the radar because of our preconceptions. So we come from Jewish background or a Christian background, and in our kind of the blinders that we have because of our background, we look at Judaism or Christianity. We forget about for most people, Yahwism doesn't even show up on the radar, but that's simply not the reality on the ground. If we were to go back, Yahwism would have been the main form of Yahweh worship in those centuries. Again, it's not a text-based religion, so it didn't have a corpus as such, like the Torah or the New Testament. But the fact that we find so many amulets all over the Roman empires, that Yahweh was considered to be the protector god by so many people all across the empire. Roman scholars in the 4th and 5th century of the Common Era were writing historical texts about the religion, different religious forms of religion in the Roman Empire, were writing about Yahweh as this really powerful deity. But they were not Jewish, they were not Christian, right? But still, they saw Yahweh as this major deity in a purely Roman context. So Yahwism, in fact, this research really kind of inverts the paradigm in that sense, because Yahwism now is to be seen, I believe, as the most powerful and the most impactful form of Yahweh worship, which, of course, prepared the ground for Christianity in its own right later on.
And when did it sort of? So then it slowly diminished over time, Yahwism, because nobody today identifies as a Yahwist.
That's right. No one does. Although I have had people that
are coming
after talking to me are like, "Yeah, I'm a Yahwist," but just kind of almost jokingly, right? Yeah. But you're right. But the thing is, Yahwism is even still there today in Kabbalah. So in the kind of the mystical arts of Judaism, and there is a Christian Kabbalah as well, much less, to a much lesser degree. But in Jewish Kabbalah, you still have a kind of divine beings. You have the 9 spheres of the Kabbalistic tree, so the Kabbalistic texts, and I'm not the first one to point that out. I mean, what has been pointed out in academic research is that the Kabbalah is very much influenced by, or at least similar to certain Gnostic elements. Okay, so there's a connection between Gnosticism, or the so-called Gnosticism. Again, that's another term I don't like to use because it's pejorative, but I use it for convenience. So Gnosticism is, elements of Gnosticism are found in Kabbalah, and it's explained through different ways. But Gnosticism is a form of Yahwism as well. So if we take a step back, Kabbalah still holds elements of Yahwism in it today. And so if you read Kabbalistic texts, you have these deities, and one of them is Yahweh, but you have other components that together are maybe components of Yahweh, depending on which school you are talking to. And you have the Shekhinah, you have a female deity as well, and she travels up and down those spheres of the mystic tree of Kabbalah. Very, very Yahwistic in many ways. Having a female deity, having these interactions, and even copulating with the male deity. So some of the foundational Kabbalistic texts are almost pornographic. I mean, I'm not the only one saying that. They have been called pornographic texts, actually describing in great detail how Yahweh is copulating with the Shekhinah. And so elements of Yahwism are still in a certain type of Judaism practiced today.
And what about paganism? How does paganism fit in? When did that sort of rise and fall as it relates to?
Well, yeah, I mean, paganism, again, another pejorative term that I try to use, but paganism, or everything that's not in Abrahamic tradition. Of course, that is a term, kind of catch-all term for everything that's not Abrahamic. So that's everything else, right?
Okay.
And so these are the different deities, the different forces of nature, like the sun and the moon and things like that people worshipped for different reasons. And that continues to this day, of course, and that happened from the beginning of time, really, when people started worshiping forces of any kind of force that can affect their lives. So that could be the sun, the moon, the storm, like the storm gods, or an ancestor, right? A mythological ancestor of the tribe or the village that they are in. So people always looked for. That's really kind of the basis of all religion, is people looking for a force that they can kind of attach themselves to, and something that would give them some kind of security and stability. Yeah.
Let's get into some of the evidence then for like some of the additional evidence that we haven't already covered for Judaism not being practiced prior to this Hellenistic period. And so we talk a little bit about Elephantine Island and the evidence that we have there.
Yeah.
Can you tell me the story of Israelites going to Elephantine Island and what we know about the time that they spent there?
Right. So Elephantine Island is in Upper Egypt, meaning southern Egypt, facing the modern city of Aswan. So just to place that geographically. According to my research, there are different views, but according to my research, the Yahwists came to this island in the middle of the 6th century, so around 550, 540, before the Common Era. And I arrive at that date using a lot of different data points, and I find where they all meet. And I have an article on that explaining the logic behind it. But there are other views back to the 7th century. But for me, it's really the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era. Now, this island, before we go into we discussed the Yahwists there. This island was a very important island for Egyptian religion millennia before the Yahwists even came there. It was initially the island of the goddess Satit, kind of the goddess of the southern boundary of Egypt, the boundary between Egypt and Nubia, and then other deities were added to this. But the basic idea was that this is the first cataract of the Nile. So the first point from the Mediterranean Sea going all the way south, it's the first point where it's really hard to cross. You can't cross with a ship or a boat. You have to carry them overland and then continue after you pass the cataract. So there's the waters there are very kind of it's a kind of a waterfall, almost a horizontal waterfall, because the waters are you can't really navigate them, and so that fact caused the Egyptians to believe that the annual inundation of the Nile, so the Nile would be completely inundated for 3 months of every year, which would cause the ground to be very, very fertile after the waters receded. That's why the Nile is so fertile, and it was such a great place to live in antiquity. You don't have to rely on rainwaters or anything like that. So this annual inundation of the Nile, they believe that the waters for this would come out of 2 caverns underneath the island of Elephantine and would cause this inundation. So it was an incredibly important island for the entire economy of Egypt, right? Which was reliant on the floods and on these waters. So it was a major island for Egyptian religion for millennia before the Yahwists even came there. Now they came under while Egypt was still under Egyptian rule. So under the 26th dynasty and the Said, what's called the Said dynasty, because they were based in Sais, in a city called Sais in Lower Egypt, and settled, and they were settled on this island and in Aswan, so on both sides of the Nile there.
How many people?
Well, of course, it varied over time, but at the most, we estimate around 3,000 to 5,000 people.
Okay.
Yahwists in this, so it's quite a bit. I mean, it's pretty big for that period.
But Jewish people would say that these were Jewish people, but we're saying that they're Yahwists.
They're Yahwists.
They're Yahwists.
Yeah, I mean, they're again, if we define Judaism as people observing commandments and Sabbath and the Sabbath and the and kosher and all of that stuff, they were not that.
Right.
And so, but they had a temple, and they had a temple to Yahweh on this island that they constructed. What's really interesting is that they constructed their temple right adjacent to the Khnum temple. So Khnum was at that point already the main deity of this island, of the island of Elephantine. Very powerful deity, a creator god, and there was a large temple complex on the island for Khnum, not just one temple, but a complex. Very, very, they invested a lot in it, and it was very beautiful, very just an opulent structure. And right next to it, I mean, literally 2 or 3 yards from it, you had the Yahweh temple, which we still have today. We still see parts of this Yahweh temple there.
Can you pull that up, Ryan?
Small parts of remains of the Yahweh temple that were identified at the beginning of the 2000s. And so the Yahwists were brought there, and but probably as mercenaries from Judea or Samaria. They were brought to Elephantine, and they were given some real estate there to establish a temple right next to the Khnum temple. And I think that's significant because there are a lot of other ethnicities in the area that were not given the right to build a temple right next to or even on the island at all. So you had Babylonians, you had other Levantine peoples out there, and they had temples in Aswan, but not on this really important island of Elephantine. And so that's one of the reasons why I believe there was some kind of identification between Chnum and Yahweh at that period in time to allow them to be side by side, and so really so close together. And Yahweh is the creator God, of course, in the Bible. Practically all major deities at that period were creator gods. But there are some parallels between Chnum and Yahweh that would point to a deeper assimilation between these two deities. So that's kind of how they started out. They got this plot of land, probably first, according to my research, first in Aswan, and only later they started migrating on the island itself. And so that's 540, 550 BCE. The Persians, so King Cambyses, conquered Egypt in 526 BCE.
They didn't have it for long then.
No, not for very. But I mean, they continued to be.
They continued to live there.
Yeah,
yeah. Okay.
They were there, and they collaborated willingly with the Persians. They were very loyal to the Persians. So we don't see any problems at that period of time. It seems like it was a pretty smooth transition. In a letter that they wrote around 410 or 47, I should say, BCE, they talk about their temple existing before the Persian conquest. So before 526 BCE, they said our fathers already built this temple before Cambyses, that's the king who conquered Egypt, the Persian king. And they say, well, that Cambyses destroyed all of the temples of Egypt, but their temple he did not touch.
Wow.
Which is mythology. It's not true.
Okay.
It's not true. I mean, Cambyses did cause damage in Egypt. I mean, he was at least the first phase of his conquest was very violent and unnecessarily so. But it's absolutely not true that he destroyed all the temples in Egypt. But they do use this hyperbolic description for whatever reason. But it's interesting that they write this to the Persian authorities. It's a letter that is addressed to the governor of Judea, who's a Persian administrator. So clearly, if they expect him to agree, so the idea that Cambyses caused great destruction in Egypt must have been very popular throughout the region, and also accepted by the Persians themselves. And I explained,
celebrated by the Persians, probably.
Although he was a Persian king, right? So, but I explain why in my article. But so this is the first phase, right? And so and we talked about kind of the smooth transition between the Scythe rule into the Persian rule. So these are the first years, kind of the 5th century, the early 400s BCE on this island, and we have some really interesting texts from that period. We have a text that where a Yahwist is blessing another Yahwist by the name of Chnum and Yahweh. So that's another data point that shows that there might have been some assimilation between these two deities, right? They are blessing by these two, and a lot of other really interesting. We can talk about this for hours, but a lot of interesting data points from that period. And the middle of the 5th century, we have relatively little data. We have some important documents, but less than we have, or a different type of from what we have from earlier periods. Things start to get really interesting around 420, 419 BCE. There's a big event that happens. And a person by the name of Hananiah arrives in Egypt. Now, this person is Yahwist, Hananiah. The element of his name, Yah, is Yahu, of the Hananiah. And that person arrived in Egypt, and this person is extremely authoritative. He literally tells the Yahwists what to do from a cultic perspective, from a religious perspective. He also, in a different time, later on, a few years later, certain Yahwists there starts to be persecution against certain Yahwists, and they are jailed on an island further down the Nile, and by the governor, the local governor of Upper Egypt. Now, the governor is so maybe a word on Achaemenid administration. The Achaemenid Empire had satrapies, or large administrative areas, and each one of these large administrative areas was run by a very powerful man who was the satrap of that satrapy. Each satrapy was divided into provinces that had governors, right? So, for example, Judea and Samaria were provinces that were part of the Eber Nahari satrapy. Okay, Egypt was a satrapy. Yeah, Egypt was a satrapy that had Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt as provinces. So these Yahwists were jailed by the governor of Upper Egypt, of the southern Egypt, and this same Hananiah was so authoritative as to, in order to negotiate the freedom of his kinsmen, he sent his slaves to negotiate, not himself. He didn't even bother going down to do it himself. He sent his slave, and they were able to free them. So we're talking about a person who was extremely authoritative, a Yahwist, who came into Egypt, who was practically had a very similar authority to the satrap himself. Okay, and that's pretty big. Someone with that level of authority who can send his slaves to negotiate with the governor. Okay. Anyway, so things start changing when he arrives. And again, as I said, they're starting to be persecuted. He is the author of a document that is erroneously known as the Passover Papyrus, or the Passover Letter. In the book that I co-edited with Professor Reinhard Kratz from Göttingen University, I have an article there that shows that this document is not really related to the Passover. Again, we talked about projection coming from, being raised in a Jewish or Christian home. That letter has an observance that needs to be kept between the dates of 15th to the 21st of Nisan. That, for people coming from a Jewish or Christian background, that immediately corresponds to the Passover, right, or the Feast of Matzot, of the unleavened bread. But that's projection. That's how we project from our upbringing, and that's what we're trying to avoid. But when you look at it scientifically, objectively, you realize that this is simply the first full moon of the year. The year starts in Nisan, so it doesn't necessarily have to relate to be the Passover. It's the first full moon of the year, but more importantly, it is the full moon at the end that kind of announces the beginning of harvest. So the entire northern hemisphere, that's when you start the harvest. And that is, in antiquity, we don't have this today. We don't understand today how important that is. But if there is a flooding during the time of the harvest, you might not survive the next year. Okay. If there is a hailstorm or any kind of storm, during the time of the harvest, you might not survive the next year. You and your family, your village, you might not be able to survive. I mean, this was an extremely critical time in antiquity, the beginning of the harvest, the time of the full moon of the month of Nisan. And so just attaching those dates necessarily to the Passover is not a scientific perspective on this data. And so, but this document was authored by this person called Hananiah, and in it he does command them, basically, these Yahwists at Elephantine to observe something. Okay, again, it's not the Passover, it's not the unleavened bread, it's something else. And in my article, I actually connect that to a Zoroastrian inspired ritual. And I do that because I start the article by showing just how much Zoroastrian influence existed at Elephantine among the Yahwists already beyond this particular document. And then I show how this corresponds well with everything else that we know. So the Zoroastrian or this early type of Zoroastrian influence is well documented at Elephantine among the Yahwists at the time. It's really important to understand that people at that time were kind of cross-pollination between different cultic systems was very, very popular, was just part of daily life. You take an idea from one and you adapt it to your own. This does not mean that they converted to Zoroastrianism or anything like that. But you take ideas, you take concepts, you adapt them, you adopt them, and sometimes if it's the empire, right? I mean, like with the Zoroastrian elements, if it's the empire, you are actually showing that you're a good citizen of the empire by adopting certain characteristics. So this does not mean that they converted to Zoroastrian, or that they were Zoroastrian. They were Yahwists, but they took elements from the Egyptian religion. They took elements from the Zoroastrian. They took elements from other Levantine religions as well, or cultic systems. And so we do need to understand just how effervescent the ancient world was in terms of just being always in touch with other ideologies, other cultic systems, and taking and kind of almost trading in cultic currency. And so
But this is very this would be very controversial, right? I mean, this is very controversial to people of the faith that believe that these were not Yahwists that came into Elephantine Island at this time. That these were, So that's it's just worth remembering, and then kind of understanding the data and the information that we do have today from Elephantine Island that does point to these people truly being Yahwists, and so we have a lot of scripts, we have scrolls, we have writings that all sort of say, hey, these people made no mention of Abraham or Moses or any of their prophets.
No knowledge of the Bible whatsoever in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
They did trade on the Sabbath. They ate whatever. They know strictly nothing about the Bible. Now they did have literary works that we found among in their archives on Elephantine. Especially the Wisdom of Achikar. Now, Achikar was the first international bestseller, really. It was just a brilliant story. It's a story about this wise man and his nephew, but also peppered with wisdom sayings as well, a lot of wisdom sayings. So it was a very, very popular work in antiquity, and they did have a copy of that. They didn't have a copy of the Bible or anything biblical, but they did have a copy of this work. And they had a copy of the Bisatun inscription. So that's Darius's Darius the First great literary work that is written on the side of Mount Bisatun in modern-day Iran. It's a trilingual inscription written in Old Persian, in Achaemenid Elamite, and in Achaemenid Babylonian. And so that's the Bisatun inscription. Extremely important document. They had an Aramaic copy of this inscription in their community, but they didn't have anything biblical. They did have literature, but not biblical. And again, there are no idiomatic expressions. They do things that are contrary to the Torah. Even in terms of legal documents, they don't follow anything that we can recognize from the Bible. So. It is very clear that there was simply no, as far as they were concerned. Again, I'm not saying that none of the texts that made it into the Bible already did not exist at that time, but at Elephantine and anywhere really, even in Palestine and in Babylonia, there is simply nothing to show any kind of familiarity with the Bible. It's interesting that in Judea and Samaria, in the 4th century, so they were able to mint coins, that their own coins. So for Yahud and so the province of Yahud and the province of Samaria, to mint coins written in Hebrew letters, so they were able to mint coins, but even these coins go against what we know from the Torah. Now, an extreme example is one coin where we have the face of the high priest and his name on the coin, right? Do not make any graven image was not known to the high priest, not just to, and this is a coin of the high priest putting his face on the coin, right? And that goes squarely against the Torah, right? Graven image of the high priest presenting himself 4th century before the Common Era.
So what does the Torah say about this?
I mean, do not make any graven image. You cannot represent iconic representation of anything. Certainly not of humans or even animals as such. So, of course...
Yet they were minting coins with...
Yet they were minting coins of the high priest, of the main religious authority. I mean, it's not just anyone. Maybe, if it was a general or whatever. But this is the high priest himself. And that's pretty strong. We have, at the later, mid-4th century, we have a cache of documents from Samaria, where these are transactions of slave sales of Jews or Yahwists selling other Yahwists as slaves to other Yahwistic buyers. That goes against the Torah as well, of selling the sale of a Hebrew slave, with no provisions at all. I mean, no limits to the time that they might be asked to be slaves. There is no. So again, no knowledge of the Bible there, and these are documents that are signed in front of the governor of Samaria. So these are not. It's not just some kind of side deal. Mm-hmm. This represents the kind of the standard way things were done. And then later on, we have another coin of a general with a Yahwistic name, riding on a horse. He mints his own coin, but on the flip side of the coin, you find Zeus as the deity, but he has a Yahwistic name. This is a Yahwist, but Zeus is the deity of this person. So this is 4th century BCE. No knowledge of the Torah, plenty of evidence of doing things that are against the Torah, all over the place. Again, each one of these cases can be excused away. So, for example, the sale of slaves, we can say, well, business was more important to them than
just breaking the law.
Than adherence to the Torah. Okay, you can explain that. But again, we don't have one positive example, not a single one for centuries of people knowing anything about the Torah. I mean, so we talked about Egypt, we talked about Palestine, but the same thing is true for Babylonia. Okay, a really strong example is a marriage contract from Babylonia, where you have two people getting married. They have Babylonian names, but all of their witnesses have Yahwistic names. So they were clearly themselves also Yahwists. The names, having a Babylonian name doesn't mean that they're not Yahwists. But all of their witnesses are Yahwists, but they swear the marriage contract, the oath in the marriage contract, is made to the local Babylonian triad, not to Yahweh. Okay, so they take an oath. These are Yahwists, but they take an oath in the name of the local Babylonian triad. So that's Babylonia. We talked about Palestine, about Judea and Samaria. We talked about Egypt. It's really all over. The entire Yahwistic sphere of existence at that time, 5th century, 4th century, is completely oblivious to anything biblical, really, all over the place.
What about evidence of synagogues or?
Yeah, no,
none.
Synagogues were much later.
Places of worship.
Temples, yes, of
temples.
Course. So we talked about the temple at Elephantine. Mm-hmm. There were other temples. There were temples in various places in Judea, in the north as well. Other temples to Yahweh. There was almost certainly another temple in Edfu in Jerusalem, in Egypt, and we know that because we have contracts where Yahwists at Edfu sign contracts with their current activity, their current profession. And some of them sign as priests. And so they are Yahwists who are priests, actively being priests in Edfu. So clearly, I mean, there must have been another temple in Edfu as well. So there were Yahwistic temples all over the place at that time, but not synagogues. Synagogue is a later invention, or later development, really. But we have several temples. Another thing that's interesting is that we have priestesses, female priests. And one document that I published last year that got a lot of attention, National Geographic and other places, translated in a lot of languages, was this document from Egypt, from Elephantine, a small ostracon, that wasn't interpreted correctly up until now. Previous scholars did not, of this particular document, did not notice that it's written in a very specific kind of poetic format, and they did not realize that it falls directly into a certain genre, a very specific genre of curse text that we know from later periods. But it corresponds perfectly with this genre. And so we have this priestess officiating and really commanding the deity in the temple at Elephantine. So this is really the first document. And this is the direct document. I mean, we have the ostracon that was written in real time in the 5th century BCE. This is not a later interpretation. This is not a historical book. This is not a biblical book. This is not Herodotus. This is the actual document that happened in real time, where we have a priestess officiating over a ceremony of some kind of curse ceremony in the temple, in the Yahwistic temple at Elephantine, commanding the deity to do something, which is part of the genre. The genre includes this type of command. And so, and that's absolutely fascinating. This is the first direct witness that we have, that we can hold in our hand, of a priestess, or really any kind of actual ceremony in a Yahwistic/Jewish temple anywhere. I mean, this is a massively important document. And the only example of this type of curse text that we have in Aramaic. So yeah, this is the one. Yeah, massively important. It's very short, but a very, very, very important document. Now, my research from this, another kind of aspect of my research, because once this came out, people, I was interviewed in several different places, and people started asking me, well, what happened? Why didn't they continue having priestesses in Judaism/Yahwism? And initially I would say, well, that's a great question. We simply don't have the data. But then I found that there are other priestesses going well into Jewish priestesses in Rome as well. In Palestine, in Egypt, there were Jewish priestesses officiating in different formats, even after the destruction of the Second Temple. I'm not saying that they were at the same level necessarily as the high priest or the male priests, but they did have a role. They did play a liturgical role in different constellations in Jewish society, or Jewish/Yahwistic society in those times. But we do have records of, and I have an article that I almost finished with, kind of just documenting these different cases where we have these women playing really important liturgical roles in Jewish society, which most people would say that simply has never been the case. But now we know that it was much more common than we previously thought.
Okay. So the synagogue thing. So in the archaeological record, what is the first evidence that we have of synagogues anywhere in the world?
Well, it depends on how you define what a synagogue is. It's basically we start seeing places where they would congregate, and this is not something. This is my friend Professor Jonathan Adler wrote a great book on the origins of Judaism, where he, as an archaeologist, really looks at the archaeological data for synagogues and things like that. So I really recommend reading that book. And so I think it's about the 2nd century BCE where we start to see places of people gathering together.
So 100 years after the.
But these are not temples. These are places of studying the text. So that when the text became authoritative. So again, we can draw a straight line from Alexandria to the synagogue because we start having authoritative texts. These were not sacred texts necessarily at that point yet, meaning that these were texts that people still felt that they can modify and they can add to, or they can still adapt to their own ideologies. And this continued for centuries later. But so they were not sacred in that sense that it's something that you cannot touch. But they were authoritative, and they were People were really fascinated by these texts, and you had different sects that had different types of interpretations of these texts, or really even offered other texts instead of the text that we are familiar with from the Bible. So a lot of the apocryphal texts that some of us might be familiar with that did not make it into the canonical Bible are by other sects that had their own different interpretation. And that's, again, I'm going back to this effervescence of that time period. And what makes my research so exciting is just dealing with this energy. When you work with the primary material, with these papyri, with these scrolls, with these ostraca, you just get the feeling of the energy that was just so overwhelming at that time period. People just exchanging ideas and looking for their own truth in different places, with their own mythology and their own theology and their own hopes and aspirations as well. And so, yeah, that was an extremely energetic period. The first centuries BC into the first centuries of the Common Era. And so, that's just really what makes my day-to-day so exciting in many ways, to read these documents. So that's about on the synagogue. And the synagogue over time, of course, after the destruction of the so-called Second Temple in 70 CE, the synagogue became the main place of worship, because there was no more temple, so to speak. So the synagogue's evolution is like that.
What about so the main prophets, or the main characters in the Old Testament? Who are name 5 or 8 of them?
Prophets: Jeremiah, of course, Isaiah, Amos, Joel, Hosea. Yeah.
So when did people begin to name their children after these people? What was the timing on that?
So some of these names we do find because they were just common names. It does not mean that they are named after, but these are like the name Hosea is very, very popular throughout the entire the entire time period. But it does not mean that it's named after the prophet.
Right.
It's just simply a very common name. So if we're looking at literary heroes, though, that's mostly from the Pentateuch. So that's people like Abraham, like Joseph, like Simon, like the 12 tribes, or like the matriarchs, like Sarah, like Rachel, Leah, etc. Those names appear absolutely nowhere before the Hellenistic period, and even then, very, very few places, very rarely. But they start appearing, they start popping on the radar from around 300 BC. So like the name Yosef, but whether it's Yosef or Yehoseph, but it already appeared, or the name Simon, and names like that. So or names that are kind of like Moses start appearing in the 3rd into the 2nd century BCE as personal names. Now, the question from a methodological perspective needs to be asked whether it was common to name children after literary heroes at all in antiquity, right? I mean, if it's not something people did, then of course you wouldn't expect it. And the answer is it was. It was a very popular thing. Even the Iranians did that. The Achaemenids did that. The Greeks, of course, did that. Even the Egyptians did that. And so we see naming. As literature became more popular, also naming children after literary heroes became more popular. So, for example, I mentioned Achikal, which was the first international bestseller. We do see Yahwists in Babylonia naming their children Achikar. It became a very, very common name as well. Now, you can argue whether this Achikar was also simply a very common name or not. I don't think so. We don't find it as a very widespread name. We do find it here and there, but in the Yahwistic or Jewish community in Babylonia, it seems to have been in a certain point in time, it started to be a very popular name. So I can't be 100% sure that this was necessarily naming after this literary hero, but it certainly looks like it. We don't have any actual document saying, well, I call my son based on this literary hero, but it's certainly looking at the data and the popularity of the name and what it corresponds to from on the time axis. It looks like it was something that was influenced by the popularity of the actual story, as it was, as I said, in other cultures around as well. So this would not be something that should surprise any of us. But they did not have biblical names. Okay, like again Moses, Aaron, any of the 12 tribes, or the matriarchs. So we simply don't see this until the 3rd century BC.
Why don't we bring it back a little bit to Yahwism and kind of the origins of Yahwism and like the first dates that we saw that appearing and what it looked like in the early days. Where did it come from?
Right, that's a great question, and it's still an open question. I have my own take on this, but it's still an open question as well. So we don't have any absolutely firm data to prove it one way or another. I'll just provide my take on it. So just before we go there, just to remind ourselves about the definition of what is Yahwism. Yahwism is simply having the deity called Yahweh as your main ethnic deity and the head of the pantheon. Not exclusive deity, not anything like that, not requiring you to do to follow any commandments, but simply your ethnic deity, the head of the pantheon. And if we look at it this way, the first possible mention of the deity Yahweh is found in 2 temples in what is modern-day Sudan. The temple of Soleb and Amara West. So these are 2 temples of Ramses II, and in there's a list of nations that he conquered in Canaan, in the Levant, and these are the shasu. They're always the shasu of a certain place or a certain deity. Shasu just simply means nomads. So these are nomads. And the Shasu of gives them some kind of definition to differentiate between different Shasu groups. So in these temples, we have the Shasu of Yahu in both of these temples. And I initially was very skeptical about this, because Yahu just might be vowels. It might not necessarily be the deity itself. But there is some parallelism in these lists of Shasu groups, where you see the Shasu of Baal and Ba'ar, because they don't have the L sound in Egyptian, but the Shasu of Baal, and of Anat, I believe, is also there. So we do have some parallelism to show that these are the Shasu of some kind of deity, and Yahweh is amongst them. So that parallelism provides the option. It's not 100% sure, okay? But because there is a parallelism, the chances become higher that this might be the first mention that we can find of this deity. Okay, so this is under Ramses II. Okay, so that's this is the parallelism that I see there, and therefore this might be. Again, I cannot be 100% sure, but this might be the first instance where we have this deity documented. The next time is only in the 9th century before the Common Era, in certain inscriptions that we find, like the Mesha stele or the Tel Dan stele. These are 9th century documents where Yahwism was already pretty much established. We have Yahwistic names with this Yahweh theophoric element in them, and even the mention of Yahweh as a deity as well. So in the 9th century, it's already established. Now, what's interesting, and I think one of the most interesting to me features or data points, is a person by the name of Yahurbidi. Now, Yahurbidi is mentioned in Neo-Assyrian inscriptions, and the only reason he's mentioned and that we know of him at all is because he rebelled against the Neo-Assyrians. He rebelled against the empire. But the way the Neo-Assyrians describe him is a Hittite. Okay, so someone who's coming from the general area of southern Turkey. A Hittite who became the king of a city called Hamat, which was an Aramean city, not a Hittite city per se. But his name is Yahu Bidi. Now, the Yahu component there, again, the question is this simply just vowels, or is this the deity? Now, in the case of Akkadian, the language has the ability, they have determinatives. So they have this little drawings next to nouns to describe what the noun means. Is it a name? Is it a deity? Is it whatever? Is it a people name, right? And here it's this determinative called the dingir determinative shows that this component of the name Yahweh is the deity Yahweh. So we can be absolutely certain that this Hittite, who is the king of an Aramean city in the 8th century before the Common Era, was a Yahwist. But he was not Judean, he was not Israelite, he was not Sumerian, he was Hittite. Okay, and if I'm now going back to the Shasu, those nomads were in the kind of eastern Syria of today or northern Jordan of today, that area, that desert area where they were nomads. So if these are really the Shasu of Yahud, that general geographic area would also correspond to where Yahubidi was in the city of Hamat. And so my take from this data, and again, we have little data to go on, so we cannot be 100% sure, but the data points that we do have all point to the area of what is modern-day Syria, Hamat, and to the east of it, as the place where Yahwism began. Okay, but it's not directly related to Judea or Israel per se. Now, there was some kind of migration happening, probably from the desert of Judea down towards the more fertile lands of Canaan, where people that were carrying this Yahwistic payload with them migrated down and settled in Canaan, and that became Judea and Samaria later on. Now, keep in mind that Israel is not Yahwistic. Israel is El. The deity called El is the deity of Israel as such. So you have, and these are deities that were in the region. So you had El, you had Baal, of course, you have Judea, which is based on Yahu in some way. So there was a debate also in scholarship whether Judea is also theophoric as a place name, because it has Yahu in it or not. My sense is even we cannot know from a purely scientific perspective if the etymology for Judea comes from the deity name Yahu or not. It's impossible to know scientifically, but through the etymology of the word. But what is clear, and we can prove this, is that in the minds of the people living in Judea, the name was Yahwistic. Okay, and it's mentioned in the Bible. The name in Judah is mentioned, is explained in the Bible itself in the book of Genesis. When the name is given, it is explained as a Yahwistic name. Okay, now I will thank Yahweh. That's the explanation of the name in Genesis. So there was clearly a popular etymology. Okay, again, it's not scientific etymology, but in the minds of the people living in Judea and the people in general who were Yahwists, the name was also Yahwistic. So in my view, it comes from the north. It comes from from modern day Syria, and followed the migrations of these tribes down to Canaan.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, good. I mean, I'd love to just close out and just, kind of focus on big picture, of your work and of your knowledge and sort of the big messages that you'd like to get across. And we talked about a few of the things already. I mean, Yahwism, the continuation of that and not just turning into Judaism or turning into Christianity, that it was its own separate path,
Right.
and that that's a big, I think, key point for people to understand.
Absolutely. I think that's a key point. That's a major development in the history of religion in general. Just realizing that there was this other option, this other religion that has flown under the radar in the modern world, just because we are all raised on either Christian or Jewish or something in between background, but we've all grown in this sphere, whether it's directly from our parents, from our communities, or even through cinema and other contexts like that. We are in the modern world conditioned to think only of Judaism and Christianity in that sphere. Of course, Islam in a different perspective, but under the radar, there was this greater religious reality of Yahwism. And I think one of the really most important things for me in my research is to dig deeper and to really understand, define, and trace the history of Yahwism and its impact on Judaism and on Christianity, and even later on, up to today, we said that there are still features. So that's a big part of what I'm planning to do now, is to focus and really get as deep as we can into the study of Yahwism, define it, trace its contours from the beginning through to today, really. Understand its interaction, its impact, and on Judaism and Christianity, and on so-called Gnosticism, and ultimately on Islam, and on other movements within the Abrahamic sphere, and also its connections with other non-Abrahamic, because different forms of Yahwism also imported. We talked about Zoroastrianism, but also it took elements of Egyptian religion, very strong elements of Egyptian religion, also of Roman religion, and so this effervescence that I referred to earlier still continued. So I think that this is a really important field of research that is now nascent. It's really new, that I am trying to go deeper and deeper and deeper into, and hopefully have students dig deeper and other institutions collaborate on this. But this is major, because our view of that period was too flat up until now. Judaism into Christianity, and then the interaction between Judaism and Christianity. But now we have this much greater context that was there, that is clearly demonstrably there, that is documented to have been there, that is documented to have been all over the Roman Empire, and now we just need to put the pieces of the puzzle together and to see how these things interoperate. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the challenge of this generation now, and what I'm really trying to focus a lot of my effort on.
Yeah, cool, fantastic. Yeah, I mean, maybe a couple of other questions that are going to be a little bit more, maybe more personal, maybe more like high level, looking at this situation of religion and in the past and in the present and in the future and where it's going to go. What is it about? What is it about? So we're talking about religion today in this conversation, but we as human beings, we can identify with a nationality, we can identify with a race, we can identify with a political party, we can identify with a football team. We can identify with just about anything and make that a part of who we are. What do you think it is about religion that makes people want to choose to be right and pick a side and pick a team and kind of perpetuate this system of beliefs that has been a part of the human experience for thousands of years?
That's a great question, and I have to say it's a relatively new phenomenon, relatively speaking. So only the last couple of millennia, 2,000 years, give or take, Before that, that simply was not that much of a problem. You really didn't have religious wars in antiquity before, give or take the turn of the millennium, of the first millennium. Because, now this is a really important aspect of ancient cult in general. And again, I'm using the word cult not pejoratively, but simply as a synonym for religion. In antiquity, you would say that this deity is the same deity that you have, just a different name for the same deity. And that's true for the New Testament as well. I mean, there is this very famous passage in the New Testament in Acts chapter 17 where Paul is in Athens and he talks about the unknown God. And he says, this God, this very same God, this very same essence that you call the unknown God, this is the God, Yahweh, basically, that I have come, or Jesus, that I have come to preach to you. So in the mind, or at least the words that were put into the mouth of Paul, I'm not sure that the historical Paul ever said that, but the words that were put into the mouth of Paul and made it into the New Testament are, in that sense, almost polytheistic, right? They see another deity, and they say that it's a different name for the same deity, right? And that's first or second century of the Common Era, whenever that passage of the Book of Acts was written. And so it goes much even later than what we would expect, possibly. And so the idea that there was this, like we are today, so tribal about this is my God and this is your God, and it has nothing to do with one another. That's a relatively new thing. And in antiquity, they would say, well, it's the same essence, but a different name. And I think part of that is due to the rise of the empires. And now we're going back to the second millennium before the Common Era. I think when you are dealing with an empire, and the larger the empire, the more acute that becomes, it becomes... these empires were so cosmopolitan by definition that it also kind of trickled down to the way people saw each other's cultic beliefs. But then what changed is a number of things. First of all, the canonization of authoritative texts changed a lot. Suddenly, that's also a technological revolution. Suddenly you can hold the so-called truth in your hand, right? You have a book, you have this rectangle that you can hold in your hand, and if people do not believe what's in this book, they are heretics. And so the invention of the book, and especially the codex, I mean this not a scroll, because the scroll is maybe a little bit more abstract. This format. The square format of the book just caused, in many ways, people to now get this simplistic idea, which was much more simplistic than it was before that now you can hold the entire truth in your hand. And that is the book has made a huge contribution to humanity, but also has caused a lot of problems, a lot of wars, and you start having religious wars. At that point in time, you did not have religious wars before that, as such. You had, of course, terrible wars, a lot of violence, but these were for other reasons.
Nationalism.
Even not nationalism is also a relatively, but empires and territory and wealth and treasure and all of these things. But they're not. Religion was not part, or cult was not part of the casus belli, of the reasons for war.
Of the ego. It's really of the ego. It's things that you can identify with.
That's right.
I can identify with a race. Well, then we can have race wars. I can identify with a nation. Well, then it's America versus Russia or China. I can identify with a religion. Well, then it's going to be religious war.
It's tribalism, one type of tribalism or another. And we're still suffering from that, obviously, today. But tribalism was always part of humanity in different ways. But I think in antiquity, things were so much more flexible Again, I'm not trying to romanticize antiquity. It was not an easy time to live in, and it was there were very violent periods of time and absolutely terrifying moments in history. And I'm not saying that everything was great and beautiful, but we were less strict about certain things, certainly about cult. And I gave an example from the New Testament. I can give other examples from around that time period as well, where people would just assume by definition that the same essential divine essence, you would call Yahweh, he would call Zeus, she would call it whatever, but it's the same one. It's exactly the same one. This is so common in antiquity, and so there was no reason to fight about this. And in fact, that's also why you can assimilate elements from Zoroastrianism or from the Greek religion or from Levantine and Phoenician religion and or Egyptian to your own cult if it makes sense in a certain context. So yeah, in antiquity, that part at least was very, very flexible. And today I think we should find that again, that kind of flexibility. In many ways today, and again, I want to stress that I don't want to romanticize the past. In many ways, in spite of all of the challenges that we have today, all of these terrible things that are happening across the world, and all of these challenges, we should recognize that this is, and I say this as a historian, today we are living in the best time ever to be a human, by far. By far. We need to understand and be thankful for this, because true, we have a lot of challenges ahead, racism and phobias of all kinds and nationalism and all kinds of problems, and that we still need but we are now living in the best times to be a human being ever in history. That's absolutely certain. There is no time that I would like to go back as a historian and to live there. I mean, I would probably survive about a few hours or maybe a few days. But we certainly need to realize just how many challenges we still face. And tribalism of all kinds is a major, major problem. And we have politicians worldwide that use and abuse this to put people one against the other in order to become more powerful for their own reasons. That is something that systematically should be fought against, and yeah, we still have tremendous challenges ahead as humanity. But if we look back, and again, as a historian looking back at these millennia that I'm studying, we can learn a lot from the ancients. Again, not trying to romanticize them; they had their own problems, but there are certain elements of their reality that we should come back to adopting, and one of them is that, if you're a religious person, you can call your deity Allah, and they can call them this deity Yahweh, and the others can call it whatever they want. But ultimately, it's the same essence. And even if you don't believe it's the same essence, we are the same essence as humans. And so, just mutual respect and mutual understanding. That's something that needs to be absolutely ingrained in people's minds, and avoid tribalism of all sorts, national, religious, etc., racial, of course. So that's something we can learn from antiquity. And as well, we talked about the Achaemenid Empire and empires in general. They were extremely cosmopolitan. On Elephantine Island, we find the Yahwists having really very close relations with their Egyptian neighbors for a while. I mean, in the latter part of their time on Elephantine, there were some tensions, but very close relations. Some of the Yahwists gave Egyptian names to their children, and some Egyptians gave Yahwistic names to the children. You also have cases of Egyptians becoming Yahwists. Again, it's not really a religious conversion; it's more of an assimilation. You have Yahwists for whom the witnesses on real estate contracts. So in a very important legal manner, the witness, so someone that is close to them, the witness for this transaction is a Zoroastrian magi. Okay, are Zoroastrian magi. So two magi, and so you have this cosmopolitan reality that I mean, these are magi, meaning these are priests of Zoroastrianism at Elephantine, being witnesses for these Yahwists. So yeah, this in antiquity we can learn a lot about cosmopolitanism, about avoiding tribalism from antiquity without necessarily resorting to romanticizing that period, which had its own challenges and problems.
Yeah, so fascinating to learn about how religion has evolved over the last really 3,000 or so years. I mean, just throughout this conversation to kind of understand how things have evolved and changed and grown. And when you look at today, where we stand, we've got 40,000 different versions of Christianity, for example, you know, and so things have become more as people identify with specific beliefs and specific belief systems, they differentiate their belief system from the person next to them's belief system. And so you branch off into all of these hundreds and thousands of different versions of the truth. And each person believes that they are in sole possession of the truth, essentially, as it relates to religion. Where do you see 2,500 years from now or 3,000 years from now, based on what you know about the nature of reality and sort of knowing? You know, if you can just put beliefs aside and you can just have a reality that's based on truth and a knowing of the nature of things. How do you see us as a species evolving past where we are today? What does the collective sort of, maybe it's not even a belief system, maybe it's just a knowing, maybe, you know, what does it look like for humanity in 2,000 or 3,000 years from now?
So of course I can't, you know, obviously I'm not a prophet and I'm a historian of the past, not a futuristic, you know. But I can tell you what I see now happening, and the fastest growing kind of movement in religion is the spiritual but not religious people, and we see more and more people gravitating towards something that is more amorphous, less strictly defined, and I think that's a good thing. That's a good thing, and that actually is in a way is closer to what it was in antiquity. It's much more. Right. It's less strictly defined, and so we have that movement, which I think will continue to grow. It makes a lot of sense in many ways. You know, people who still are. It's important for them to be spiritual, and to do research on different options that they have spiritually speaking. But they don't want to be too strict on this and to be too dogmatic or too tribalistic. And I think that's going to probably continue. Now, history is always moving in cycles. There's always, you know, back and forth. There was a major event in the 18th century where people got kind of at least in the so-called Western world, where there was this sudden departure from strict religion. You know, the French Revolution and the entire. Even the philosophical currents that created this country, all right, and you know that the founders were always thinking about that and about religion in different ways, and so that started in the 18th century. And believe it or not, we are only at the beginning of, even today, we're only at the beginning of this process, of this evolution. Think that religion as such was developed, strict religion, developed at least from around 2,000 years ago to the 18th century, or from this, you know, codex, from these books that are so strict and place everything neatly in one box. To the 18th century. Again, before that, it was much more fluid. But from the idea of a canonized text, which is around 3rd, 4th century of the Common Era. So from that point until the 18th century, we were living in a much stricter world that has started to come apart in the 18th century, in large part by exposure to the East, by realizing that there are the Vedas, right, the Vedic texts and the Avestan texts of the Indo-Iranian world that are much older than the Hebrew Bible, and as rich as the Hebrew Bible in many ways. And so people started to say, well, Hebrew is not the language of creation. What? And so that started to undo many centuries of dogmatic thought. And we're still at the beginning of this. Now, we had, in the 19th century, we had reactionary movements against this movement of enlightenment, so to speak. And then we had movements going back to more scientific approach, and then we had movements going back reactionary. I think today, in certain parts of the world, we are still seeing reactionary movements back to a more dogmatic religion, and parts of the world that are moving actually away from dogmatic religion to a more open society. So history there's always back and forth. There's always ebb and flow. And it's not just on the temporal axis, but also on the geographic location. Some places are moved differently over time, and we're going to continue to see this. But I think the overall trend over time, even with all these ebbs and flows, the overall trajectory, the overall trend that we cannot deny is moving away from dogmatic religion and into a more universal concept, and more based on actual scientific data rather than dogmatic, data and a certain corpus of text that is necessarily to be understood in a certain way. You were talking about the Catholic Church earlier. The Catholic Church, as opposed to other, for the Catholic Church, it's not necessarily this one book. There's the tradition of the Church Fathers, right? So I think in that sense, certainly in the 20th century, we have seen the Catholic Church become more flexible in the way it absorbs things like evolution and things that were harder for other denominations to accept, just because it's kind of moving away from this one book that has to be the end all and be all of faith. And I think it was Pope John Paul II who said that, and I think that's really astute, where he said that, or one of the popes, I think it was him, but I'm not sure, who said that the number of denominations is equal to the number of individuals. Each one has their own view and their own take, and really their own cult, reality. Yeah. And we should have recognized that. And I think in the spiritual but not religious movement, that becomes the reality. I mean, each one is spiritual, not religious, in their own way, and he or she just moves and does their best to be a good person, and to go down the path of spirituality. And maybe like we saw in antiquity, all this assimilation and cross-pollination. So they might go and say, well, I really like this about Islam, and I really like this about some form of Christianity, or I really like this about Judaism, I really like this about Hinduism, so I'll make that part of my life. That's the way it was in antiquity in many ways. Right. It was not exactly the same way, not exactly from the same perspective, but this cross-pollination was also very strong in antiquity, and I think that's a good thing. That makes us more open, that makes us more richer, really also gives us a richer experience as humans in general. So I think overall the trend is that we need to understand that we are still at the beginning of this process that started in the 18th century. It seems like it's the 18th century, so you're already well advanced. No, it's still the beginning of the process. But the overall trend, even with all these ebbs and flows and reactionary movements trying to go back to the glories of the past, even with all this, the overall trend, I think, is absolutely clear and cannot be undone. And that's a process that goes now outside of these boundaries, these tribal boundaries, and into a richer world.
Yeah, that's really well said, and beautiful perspective. For me, it's and this is just my perspective today. You know, it can change tomorrow, and it was different yesterday. But a belief is a self-created reality. And it's sort of as simple as that. And when we have a combination of beliefs, we create a very unique and individual reality. And whether those beliefs are of the nature of religious or any other types of beliefs that we might have, we're creating our own separate reality. And so when we have 8 billion people on this planet that all have different beliefs, then we have created 8 billion separate realities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's why there's so much conflict, and that's why there's so much war and fighting and disagreements and arguments. It's because the realities that I've created is different than the reality that you've created. And so the truth needs no defense. But what does need defending is a belief system and something that's self-created that's a story that needs to be understood and explained. And so that's a very dangerous world to live in, and it's a world that's just has a lot of conflict in it currently. And I agree with you. I think that as we move into the future, it becomes less about belief systems, and it becomes more about spirituality. And so today we fill the gap between not knowing and knowing with beliefs for the most part. And so if there's something that I don't know the answer to, there's going to be a story that I'm going to create an answer to whatever the story is, or create a theory, or create whatever it is that I'm creating. To fill that gap between not knowing and knowing. But if we can fill the gap with just wonder and curiosity and openness, then the world becomes a completely different place. If we can kind of let go of beliefs, and if we can just say, I'm not going to attempt to define myself through my beliefs, or through my race, or through my nationality, or through my religion, or through my political affiliation, or through my football team, or through my I'm not going to define myself through my choice of vehicle. I'm not a Ford person or a Toyota person or an EV person or whatever. We cling on to job title. We cling on to possessions. We cling on to social roles, and we cling on to economic situation as a self-definition for who we are.
Right.
And it's really a false self. It's not really our true self. And so that spirituality component does get into who you are, your true self. And so for me, that's that natural next step in human evolution, is understanding true self. And with true self, we don't have beliefs that make us who we are. We fill that gap with openness and wonder and curiosity and the innate sort of emotions that belong to all human beings.
Yeah, but as I listen to you, I mean, one of the main reality, I don't even want to call it a challenge. This is a reality that's going to be with us from now to, I don't know how many millennia forward, is the internet. And this is kind of the global brain that we now have as humans all over the world, sharing these virtual neurons amongst ourselves. There's this world brain, right? That we're all always plugged into in one way, shape, or form. That is a huge, huge challenge. That is a major change in the history of humanity. You know, we talked about the second millennium, like the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and all these ages in history that we deal with. What we don't recognize necessarily is that we are now living through a new age in history, the digital age, that is completely, completely different from anything humanity has known up until now. So the fact that we have this global brain, which is the internet, that we plug into, that we get our information from, that information can be now designed to cause us to react in a certain way. So that is something that needs to be really... now, the only way to manage this in a healthy way, first for humanity, is by education. That's something you can regulate to a certain degree, and you need to be very cautious about regulating it. But the most important thing is to educate the future generations about how to consume information, this massive information that is flowing through this global brain critically.
And it used to be the Library of Alexandria.
There you go.
Now it's the internet.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, orders of magnitude greater, and it's available to all of us in our pockets.
Right.
And so the internet is a huge challenge. I mean, it's a huge opportunity as well, but it's also a huge challenge for us, and for, if we're talking about future religion, all future religion is going to be internet related somehow. This is because religion always attaches or latches itself onto the reality, the spiritual reality, and the communications of its era, the communication channels of its era, whether it's through books, through wandering prophets going from town to town, scrolls and things like that. Religion always is dependent on communication channels. From now and into the foreseeable future, religion will be attached to this global brain, which we call the internet, in some way, shape, or form. We need to be very responsible about how this is going to be used, not by overregulation, but by education, and especially educating people on how to consume from the earliest age, that is where it's applicable, how to consume data critically, what to trust, what to question. And the more critical thinking we have and we implement in our systems in general, in our education system, in our schools, and even kindergartens, we can the better off we will be. Don't tell people what to believe, but give them the ability to question and to critically examine. And to not just look at one source of information, but always check with other sources of information and cross-check. But I think this is going to be the challenge for the new generations. The future religion will be internet-based in many ways. And the internet is going to be the main factor shaping the religion, human religion moving forward.
Right, because the internet is the source of the information,
right?
And so we will latch onto that information and make it a part of who we are, just like the Great Library was the source of information. And
but for for that library, you had to go to the library.
Yeah. No, it's much easier now. Yeah.
It's not just much easier; it's pervasive. It's you spend such a big part of your day, and all of us together are plugged into this global brain, right? At the same time.
Well, that's the beauty of spirituality, is that is the recognition that we are spirit as opposed to we are brain, or we are mind, or we are our information. I mean, one of the first things that you learn or that you realize through spirituality is the realization that I am not my mind. And when you realize that you're not my mind, then you realize that you're not the things that my mind identifies with, whether it's a story or whether it's a bit of information. And you're right, the internet is a brain, just like the library was a brain. And we can interact with that brain, and we can interact with that mind, and we can hear the knowledge, but we don't have to identify with it. We don't have to believe it. We can transcend that stage of where we currently are as a species and move much more towards what you defined, I think, rather articulately, was spiritual but not religious. The recognition that I am life, not that I have a life, but that I am life. I'm not. If it's when we let the mind, when we start to identify with our minds, then that's when we start to believe that I have a life, because I am the mind that has a life,
right,
as opposed to just being life and just being. So
what's interesting also is that without a doubt, and we see that throughout history, that the major religious movements adapt themselves to new realities, so, like the Roman reality and the and later on the kind of the Byzantine or the Islamic realities, and whatever they had to deal with. I do expect every major religion today. So the Jewish religion, the Christian religion within all its movement, like the Catholic Church and and the various the Orthodox Church, the churches, and on all of these different movements to experience major changes in the next coming generation or two because of the internet. Okay, they will become also they will have to adapt to this new medium very consciously and very deeply, because this is going to be the reality moving forward. We are in a new age now, the digital age. Like there was a Bronze Age, Iron Age. Now we are in the digital age, and this is, I mean, people living in this, in the kind of the transitionary period between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, they didn't know that they were in the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. They had no idea that they're in an age shift. And we have no idea now. I mean, we are living there, and we take it for granted. But this is a major, in history, we don't realize this, but we are at a major point in history of huge changes that is going to impact everything. And if we're talking about religion, certainly all religious forms are going to have to be impacted by this. The spiritual, but not religious, is much more flexible by definition, so it's easier for it to adapt. But everything will have to adapt. I mean, Islam has to adapt to it. Christianity, Judaism, everyone has to now adapt to this new reality, which is nothing we've ever experienced as a species, ever. I mean, there was nothing like this. Now we have this, in antiquity, they talked about anima mundi, the soul of the earth. That was a Neoplatonic concept. And now we're kind of experiencing this but able to interact with it. The internet is this major, almost a living creature that we're all plugged into. But we have that is going to be a major factor in shaping religion from now into foreseeable future.
Yeah, fascinating. What so what did we not cover, if anything? What seemed like we covered a lot there.
We covered a lot.
Yeah. Are there any other big points that you wanted to convey on the show, or?
I mean, we talked between us about the scrolls, and we talked a little bit about my work on Zoroastrianism. But I think that would be too confusing for people. So I think we've covered, and everything we talked about so far is very coherent. It's one field, really large. We talked about today. We even talked about the future. Yeah. So I think this is all very coherent and very good.
Good.
As it stands.
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed it.
Me too. I enjoyed it. And thanks for the questions. I mean, I've never been asked about the future before, so this opens up a new,
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of project it out and to kind of see what the next steps could be and where we're actually going. And you're right, the internet's a big part of that. The brain that we use to access all of our information is a huge part of guiding that forward. And there's going to be a lot of truth that comes out and that's able to spread very, very easily without people being able to control the narrative now. So that's going to be a major influence on the direction forward that we go. And ultimately that should lead towards more truth. It should lead more towards more just openness, less closed-minded, dogmatic belief system, and more towards.
And that starts with education. We really should focus on educating the next generations to think critically, not blindly consume anything, but think critically about anything. Not to be pessimistic, but not to be, in that sense, critical, but just always give them the tools. Because we've seen, so many populist movements out there, like we see in the elections here and in Israel and in Europe now. So much populist movements are able now to use the internet and to abuse the internet, really, to create divisions between people. Islamophobia all over the place in Europe and here, which is a huge problem.
Which is ridiculous. I mean, it's one of the more peaceful religions that exist.
That's exactly right. And Islamophobia, I think, is probably the biggest challenge that we have today to diffuse the Islamophobia. And of course, we suffer from Islamophobia in Israel, but also Europe. There's so much misinformation about Europe, about the Muslims taking over and nonsense like that. And Islamophobia is a huge challenge, but it can be countered by critical thinking. There's so much false information that is being spread about Muslims all over the place, which is absolutely false information. If you have critical thinking and you check the data, you see that it's completely wrong. But people just believe that Europe is now overrun with Muslims and absolutely going, within 10, 15 years, it's only going to be Sharia law. Nothing like that is even contemplated or even close to being the case. But a lot of people choose to believe it just without any critical thinking. And so that's why I think that education should be focused, and that it should be one of the main goals that we have as a species all over the world, to develop critical thinking skills. Always check the data. Don't trust anything that is sent, blindly trust anything that is said to you. Check it again. And that's the advantage of the internet. So using the internet, now we can check the data. We have access, right? So to use the internet, instead of it being used as a force of evil, to use it as a force of good. And that's the challenge, I think, of the next generation, of this generation and the next generations, plural.
Well said. Well, how can people follow you? How can people find your work?
I think the best way is through my academia webpage, which I think will probably have a link on the podcast. And that's the best way to follow me. Every time I have an article, I just post it there, or even just a presentation for a lecture, or maybe even something that was written about my research and external. So I try to post everything there.
Nice. Yeah. Safe travels back to Israel.
Thank you.
How do you see that? Just maybe in closing, how do you see that the end to the conflict?
Wow, that's another episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does it end anytime soon?
Yeah, I don't see it ending anytime soon, unfortunately.
Yeah.
If I were to talk about that would take another 2 or 3 hours.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, safe travels back.
Thank you.
I learned a lot, so it was really great to chat with you.
Great questions, and really just
cool.
You opened up also for me. I've never really. I do think about the future, but I've never actually had to formulate that and express that. So I think that's a very. I really enjoyed talking about that.
Good.
And in general, just talking about this.
Appreciate that. Yeah, it's a fun thought experiment to go through for sure. So awesome. Appreciate your time, man. Great to meet you. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks again.
Yep.